Hello and welcome to the BE Knowledge Share. In this episode, I will cover the first task of the Plan Business Analysis and Monitor, Chapter 3 of the BABOK Guide. So without further ado, let's get started. So part of task 3.1 is to plan the business analysis approach. In the previous episode, we kind of came up with a mnemonic to learn or understand or remember the 5 tasks associated with planned business analysis approach and monitoring. And it was Amanda eats good Italian pasta. A for Amanda stands for planned business analysis approach, which is section 3.1. The purpose of planned business analysis approach is to define an appropriate method to conduct business analysis activities. Think of it as more of a planning or brainstorming of how you would go about planning your analysis effort and what sort of approach you'll be using. Business analysis approaches describe the overall method that will be followed when performing business analysis work on a given initiative, how and when tasks will be performed, and the deliverables that will be produced. Business analysts may also identify an initial set of techniques to use. This list may change as the initiative proceeds and the business analyst gains a deeper understanding of the change and its stakeholders. The business analysis approach should align to the overall goals of the change. It should coordinate the business analysis tasks with the activities and deliverables of the overall change. It should include tasks to manage any risks that could reduce the quality of the business analysis deliverables or impede task efficiencies, and they should leverage approaches and select techniques and tools that have historically worked well. So all this boils down to, and I don't think you should overthink this. This is more so ensuring on the front end that the business analysis work or the approach aligns with the goals and the objectives of the project. They basically also have a built-in sort of risk management effort documented somewhere or understood, and then also ensuring that you are kind of leveraging similar approaches that have been used in the past on other projects. It could be similar projects throughout the organization or similar projects that you may have worked on that you can leverage that have worked successfully. So nothing to overthink, just sort of understand alignment with the objectives as well as referencing any sort of past activities or approaches that may have been utilized, as well as ensuring that you manage any sort of risks as a BA and understand how to go about managing those risks. Now, within this task of coming up with an approach, there's certain elements to keep in mind is the planning approach. So regardless of the approach, planning is an essential task to ensure value is delivered to an enterprise. Planning typically occurs more than once on a given initiative as plans are updated to address changing business conditions and newly raised issues. The business analysis approach should describe how plans will be altered if changes are required. There are various planning methods used across perspectives, industries, and enterprises. Many planning methods fit somewhere along a continuum between predictive and adaptive approaches. So let's pause here. What is an adaptive approach? An adaptive approach is basically agile, so very iterative. And a predictive approach is SDLC, meaning more waterfallish. And when I say waterfall, it's more like make sure that your requirements are all set up front and then secure sign-off and then go to testing and then development. Versus an agile approach is very iterative, where you ensure that the changes are happening iteratively and you have a process in place to approach those sorts of requirements or changes. Now, predictive approaches are typically very formal. So when we say formal, there's some sort of governance body that looks into changes that come through. When I say governance body, may not necessarily be a group of people. It could be as simple as change comes in, you analyze the work, you document, okay, what are the business impacts? And then you kind of secure more formal sign-offs versus in an agile sort of framework, Because the delivery is very rapid, there's rapid delivery, the approach is informal. So things come in, yes, there'll be a prioritization process in place, but you kind of value the changes based on what the stakeholders are placing on that requirement. So when you're planning the approach, you're going to look at it from the lens of the methodology as well. Formality and level of detail of business analysis deliverables. So going back to the first point in the key elements, you want to take into consideration there's different sort of methodologies. So the more predictive methodology is in delivering a project, the more formality there will be. But if it's an agile or an adaptive approach, then it's less of a formality that you'll be engaged in. So think of it as these two approaches: formality high on a more of an SDLC sort of approach, and formality is lower on an agile approach. So the next effort over here, the grid over here, provides a very good understanding of predictive versus adaptive. So if you look at predictive for solution definition, it's defined before implementation to maximize control and minimize risk. In adaptive, the solution definition is defined in iterations to arrive at best solution or improve or adjusting solutions. Now, in some instances, some organizations use hybrid approaches, right? So you have a combination of predictive and adaptive, okay? So in those instances, it's just weighing the level of formality and coming up with an agreement with your stakeholders to ensure that you're capturing the right level. So the next one's level of formality. In predictive approaches, it's very formal, versus adaptive, it's informal. In adaptive, the information is gathered through team interaction and feedback. Activities. Activities required to complete deliverables in predictive is identified first and then divided into tasks, versus in adaptive, activities are divided into iterations with deliverables first, and then the associated tasks are identified. So your deliverables are kind of the forefront within the adaptive approach. Timing. Tasks are performed in specific phases versus an adaptive, that's for predictive, versus an adaptive, tasks are performed iteratively. So this all boils down to iterative versus non-iterative. If it's non-iterative, then there's high level of formality. The activities are required to complete deliverables. So the focus is more on activities, versus an adaptive, the focus is more on, okay, what are the deliverables? Let's kind of align our tasks to those deliverables. The next element is the business analysis activities. A business analysis approach provides a description of the types of activities that the business analyst will perform. Frequently, the organization's adopted methodologies influence the activities that are selected. Integrating business analysis activities in business analysis approach includes identifying the activities required to complete each deliverable, and then breaking each activity into tasks, dividing the work into iterations, identifying the deliverables for each iteration, and then identifying the associated activities and tasks, or using a previous similar initiative as an outline and applying the detailed tasks and activities unique to the current initiative. Right? So that's the business analysis activities element. And lastly, there is the timing of the business analysis work. Business analysts determine when the business analysis tasks need to be performed and if the level of the effort will need to vary over time. This type of planning includes determining whether business analysis tasks performed within the other knowledge areas will be performed primarily in specific phases or iteratively over the course of the initiative. The timing of the business analysis activities can also be affected by the availability of resources, priority and/or urgency of the initiative, other concurrent initiatives, or constraints such as contract terms or regulatory deadlines. So the timing of business analysis work is very different in adaptive versus in a predictive sort of environment. In a predictive environment, it's pretty straightforward, where you're going in first, gathering all the requirements, and then kind of handing that over down the chain or development testing. Versus an adaptive becomes a little tricky, right? So it's coming up with an approach to say, okay, I'm going to gather my requirements maybe 2 sprints ahead of the actual development work. Okay. And then you kind of plan it accordingly and you keep prioritizing the requirements because remember, requirements keep changing in an adaptive approach since it is iterative in a sense. So planning that timing and to deliver is key in making sure you're on top of what's next in your backlog is important. Number 5 is complexity and risk. The complexity and the size of the change and the overall risk of the effort to the organizations are considered when determining the business analysis approach. Now, as complexity and risk increases or decreases, the nature of the scope of business analysis work can be altered and reflected in the approach. The approach may also be altered based on the number of stakeholders or the business analysis resources involved in the initiative. As the number of stakeholders increases, the approach may be adjusted to include additional process steps to better manage the business analysis work. Other factors that can impact complexity include size of the change, the number of business areas or systems affected, geographic and cultural considerations, and there's a bunch more here. But in general, when you're looking at complexity and risk, you're taking that into consideration when you are coming up with an approach for your business analysis effort. And there's a bunch of risks you want to consider when planning your approach. Acceptance. The business analysis approach is reviewed and agreed upon by key stakeholders. In some organizations, the business analysis process may be more structured and require key stakeholders to sign off on the approach to ensure all business analysis activities have been identified, estimates are realistic, and the proposed roles and responsibilities are correct. Any issues raised by stakeholders when reviewing the approach are documented by the business analyst and resolutions are sought. Stakeholders also play a role in reviewing and accepting changes to the approach as alterations are made to accommodate changing conditions across the initiative. So acceptance varies for the approach based on, also whether it's agile versus predictive. In some instances, organizations are very formal. So there's some sort of governance involved where stakeholders have to agree upon the approach. And in some organizations, there may not be a solid sort of acceptance governance. In that case, you would kind of review it with your stakeholders and they would say, hey, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. And in some instances, stakeholders may not want to see that level of detail, but just a high level understanding of this is how we're approaching requirements. Are you available stakeholder during that time period? And in an agile methodology, you may not get to the acceptance up until it's close to gathering those requirements. So you may chunk out the effort and then kind of for each chunk plan the approach. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at acceptance. There's a couple of guidelines and tools you want to keep in mind for this specific task. And one is business analysis performance assessment, business policies, expert judgment, methodologies and frameworks, stakeholder engagement approach. So the first one is business analysis performance assessment. This provides results of previous assessments that should be reviewed and incorporated into all planning approaches. Business policies defines the limits within which decisions must be made. They may be described by regulations, contracts, agreements, deals, warrants, warranties, so on and so forth. These policies can influence the business analysis approach. Now, a good example could be more so when you're working with a vendor. There may be a certain thing within the contract that you can only approach a vendor within a specific time frame. So you want to keep that in mind. The next one is expert judgment, used to determine the optimal business analysis approach. Expertise may be provided from a wide range of sources, including stakeholders on the initiative, organizational centers of excellence, consultants or associations, and industry groups. Prior experiences of the BA and other stakeholders should be considered when selecting or modifying an approach. So you as a BA may be a senior BA and you have had past experience working on specific efforts. So in that case, you would kind of leverage your previous experience on what worked versus not worked to come up with an approach. Methodologies and frameworks, we kind of spoke about those through different sections, but essentially it boils down to, okay, what sort of, are you using Agile, are you using SDLC, are you using more of a hybrid approach? So try to understand what sort of methodologies and frameworks are being used and tailor your approach accordingly. Stakeholder engagement approach, understanding stakeholders and their concerns and interests may influence decisions made when determining the business analysis approach. So what works with stakeholders, what doesn't work with stakeholders should all be understood up front. And in Agile, things keep changing. Stakeholders could change as well as in SDLC. So keeping tabs on the engagement approach is critical. Revisiting that is important. Now, techniques is a bunch of techniques. You have anything from brainstorming, business case, document analysis, estimation, financial analysis, functional decomposition, interviews, item tracking, lessons learned, process modeling, reviews, risk analysis, and management, scope modeling, survey or questionnaire, and workshops. So a bunch of techniques used here that the BA can kind of leverage to build an approach. Now, as far as stakeholders engaged in this effort would be your domain subject matter expert. You could be a project manager, your regulator, or your sponsor. Your domain subject matter expert can be a source of risk when their involvement is required and availability is lacking. The approach taken may depend on availability and level of their involvement with the initiative. So understanding, well, how engaged are they? Are they buying into this project? So understanding that sort of lens of your domain subject matter is important in order to kind of build that approach, and making sure that this person's available is critical as well. Project manager determines that the approach is realistic for the overall schedule and timelines. The business analysis approach must be compatible with other activities. The regulator may be needed to provide approval for aspects of the business analysis approach or decisions made in tailoring the process, especially in organizations where the business analysis approach or process is audited. Sponsor. A sponsor can provide needs and objectives for the approach and ensures that organizational policies are followed. The selected approach may depend on availability and involvement with the initiative. So there's only 4 sort of stakeholders involved in this. So last of all is the case study, right? So we've looked at a couple of tasks through the lens of Amanda, who is a business analyst, who's been brought on a project to move a restaurant's business online. She uses the task to plan out her business analysis approach. What she needs on the project are the needs of the stakeholders as the input. So that's an important thing for her to understand. Well, what are the needs of the stakeholders? She considers the organization's standards, tolerance for uncertainty, and previous experience with different approaches when planning the business analysis activities. Since they're using Agile, she maps out an initial approach without too much formality. She does not need approval from the stakeholders. She considers the complexity of the effort as she maps the approach. She frequently adjusts the approach as she moves along in the effort. She uses the business analysis performance assessment to guide her with this effort, business policies, expert judgment, methodologies and framework, stakeholder engagement approach. She uses different techniques, but primarily she's using the interviews and workshops to come up with an approach. She works with Ben, the domain SME, Tim, the project manager, the health regulator, and the sponsor to come up with an approach. So this concludes the first task of the 3rd chapter of Planned Business Analysis Approach and Monitoring. And in the next few episodes, I will cover the remaining tasks step by step. And please do consider subscribing to this channel, as well as viewing our website at baknowledgeshare.com. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and see you.